Saul was crowned as the first king of Israel in 879 BCE. He failed at his first and most critical mission, and God swore to transfer the monarchy to a better candidate. God then instructed the prophet Samuel to secretly visit Jesse, a leading sage from the tribe of Judah, and to anoint the youngest of Jesse's 8 sons as the future king. David was later known as the sweet singer of Israel, a divinely inspired psalmist and harpist. But at that time, David was a lowly shepherd boy, a fearless, ruddy youth who spent his days alone in the wild. Rejected by his own siblings, God was the boy's only friend, but God knew him better than anyone else. King Saul was stricken by bouts of depression and instability, and for the first time in his life, young David was appreciated. The shepherd boy's sweet music was Saul's only relief. Thus the two kings shared a single roof. Goliath, the Philistine giant, terrorized the Israelite warriors until he was slain by the shepherd boy's slingshot. David became an instant celebrity. David led defensive military campaigns and was adored by all the Jews except King Saul, who suspected that David was the replacement monarch that God had promised. His animosity exploded, and he tried to kill David, who fled into hiding. David narrowly escaped many attempts at his life, while King Saul rejected David's pleas for reconciliation. After a brief period of playing a deadly game of cat and mouse, Saul's life ended in a battle with the Philistines. He was bitterly mourned by the good-hearted David, who was crowned king in 877 BCE by his own tribe of Judah, and a few years later, at the age of 30, by the rest of Israel. David conquered Jerusalem and established it as his capital. He built a palace, subdued Israel's formidable foes, and brought the Ark of God's covenant to Jerusalem with great fanfare. David laid plans for the first Jerusalem temple, but God told him to leave the actual construction to his son Solomon. God promised David an eternal dynasty, for even the Messiah would be his descendant. Just as David's life climbed to a tranquil peak, the disturbing episode we will explore in today's lesson erupted like a sudden cloudburst.
It happened to the turn of the year, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab, along with his servants and all of Israel, and they destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, while David stayed in Jerusalem. It happened toward evening that David arose from his bed and strolled atop the roof of the royal palace. From there he noticed a beautiful woman bathing. David sent to inquire about the woman, and he was told that she was Batsheva, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. David sent messengers and took her. She came to him, and he lay with her, and she had just completed the purification rite after her menstrual period. She then returned to her house. Batsheva conceived. She sent a message to David saying, "I am pregnant." David sent a message to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." So Joab sent Uriah to David.
So David was in a bind. Batsheva was pregnant, and since Uriah, her husband, was many miles away, it was a matter of time for David's relationship will become public knowledge. So he recalls Uriah for a little bit of a break from the battle zone. He assumed that whilst Uriah is home, Uriah will become intimate with his wife, and no one would question, nobody would question the lineage and the legitimacy of the child that would be born. That was his big plan. As we see now, that plan didn't work.
Uriah came, David inquired concerning the welfare of Joab, the people, and the waters. Then David said to Uriah, "Go to your house and wash your feet." Uriah departed from the king's house, and the royal feast was sent after him. But Uriah lay down to sleep at the entrance of the royal palace, and of the king's servants he didn't go to his house. David was informed that Uriah didn't go to his house. David said to him, "Are you not coming from a journey? Why did you not go to your house?" Uriah responded, "The ark and Israel and Judah are living in huts, and my master Joab and my master's servants are encamped in the field, and I should go to my house to eat, drink, and lie with my wife. By your life and by the life of my soul, I will not do such a thing." David said, "Stay here another day, and tomorrow I will send you back to the battlefield." So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. In the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his bed among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it to Uriah to deliver. In it, he wrote, "Place Uriah at the forefront of the fiercest battle, and then withdraw from behind him, so that he will be struck and killed." When Joab besieged the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew that the strongest defenders were stationed. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Among them was Uriah the Hittite. Uriah the Hittite's wife heard that her husband had died, and she mourned him. The mourning period passed, and David sent for her and brought her to his house. She became his wife and bore him a son.
So this is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. It's without a doubt a shocking story. Apparently, it's a clear case of at least two, most important, the two main violations over here are adultery and murder or murder conspiracy. And what's remarkable about this story, though, is not so much that that an ancient king was guilty of such behavior is not so shocking. I mean, we could fill many books with many stories about kings who committed all kinds of abominations. What's remarkable about this story, the reason why it stands out, is somehow David managed to survive this, and somehow with his reputation more or less intact. His kingdom and his reputation, at least in traditional Jewish circles, outside the world of academia, who maybe come from a more of a cynical slant, David is regarded as a hero. We always see him as a hero. He's considered a tzaddik, he's considered a holy person of the highest order. I'll give you some examples in a moment, but just to build off the main question, or the main crux of the story that we want to deal with, is why he was exonerated, meaning how is it that he managed to survive this story with his reputation intact. And it's not just curiosity, because we really want to know, we want to identify the circumstances that exonerated this leader. That maybe will help us how we view our leaders. Everybody, our culture loves a good controversial story. We all love a good scandal. There's an entire business that's built off scandals. And when a leader is caught red-handed, whether it's a rabbi or a priest or an athlete or a president, right? There's nothing right. And this is an older course. This was made a number of years ago, so it's very relevant today.
Before Fox and CNN.
Yeah. When he's caught cheating, when he's caught stealing, it's human nature. We love this stuff. We eat it up. And sometimes to an extreme. So the question is, can we judge these people fairly? And it's not just to other people, it's also a question to ourselves. Are we able to forgive ourselves? Are we able to reinstate our perceptions of ourselves in our previous, held positions? So David was given a second chance. That's clear, and that's what we're going to learn about today. The question is why? And more importantly, the question is, do we also get a second chance? You could say there's an easy way to explain David's reputation as a holy person and as a spiritual giant by simply saying it's the rabbi's fault. So we all read the Bible. The Bible clearly describes his behavior. But the rabbis, as we'll soon learn, specifically in two passages in the Talmud, conveniently decide to overlook this incident, and that somehow kind of trickled down into basically David being, keeping his reputation intact. Heroes always remain heroic. How do we know that that's the case? Well, first of all, we have to explain the Talmud. We're going to go through that because the narrative clearly doesn't support it. But just to focus on David himself, time and again, we have stories how the Bible tells us of many leaders who were disposed and then lost their position, but not David. David survives. And there's a bigger issue over here, is that besides this story alone, you look at the larger biblical context of David's life, you have to take into the fact that even after this story, not only was he not removed from his position, but God actually continues to love him. We know David most famously from the book of Psalms, where many times he is considered, God actually writes that he refers to him as time and again, as David my servant. He continuously calls him that. And whenever David's descendants, there were many kings that came from David that behaved inappropriately, time and again, God would always respond, really I should destroy you, but it's in the merit of David, my servant, whom I love, that I'll spare you. Kind of like whenever the Jews misbehaved, and God will evoke, or Moses will evoke the patriarchs and matriarchs, and God will spare us in the merit of them. So somehow David became like that type of paradigm. He was put in that category. If you look in text too, what does it say? It says, Shnei parnasim tovim amdu lehen Yisrael, Moshe v'David. Two great leaders emerged from among the Jewish people, Moses and David. Unbelievable. So the Talmud literally equates David with Moses. Moses never did such a thing. We never had such a story that we just read about with Moses. The worst thing Moses does is actually in this week's Torah portion is when he hits the rock, instead of speaking to the rock. For thousands of years, Jews have been praying for the restoration of the Davidic dynasty. We mention it every day in our prayers. Malchus Beis David, as Samach David Avdecha. All over the prayers, it's mentioned this idea that we pray for the time when Mashiach comes and God will restore our home in Israel and the kingdom of David. You know, the essence of David. We talk about the Davidic dynasty. We talk about Mashiach and David, right? And what's the most famous song that every child, growing in Hebrew school? David Melech Israel Chai Chai V'Kayam. Right? David, king of Israel, lives and endures. This is like our almost like one of our mantras. It's one of the most famous Jewish sayings. And it's like, why are we putting this guy on a pedestal after the story that we just read? No one in history ever committed such seemingly egregious sins.
God was upset with David's actions. He dispatched Nathan the prophet to David with a message. Nathan came and said, "There were two men in a city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, while the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and raised. The ewe grew up together with him and his sons. Of his bread it would eat, from his cup it would drink, and in his bosom it would lie. It was to him like a daughter. A wayfarer came to visit the rich man. The rich man was unwilling to take of his own flocks and herds to prepare for the guest, so he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for his guest. David became very angry at the rich man. He said to Nathan, "As God lives, this man deserves to die. The ewe he shall repay fourfold because of his deed and because he had no pity." Nathan said to David, "You are this man. So says the God of Israel. I anointed you as king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you the house of your master and the women of your master into your bosom. I gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. If this all were too little, then I would have given you more and then some more. Why have you scorned the word of God to do what is evil in my eyes? You have struck Uriah the Hittite with the sword. His wife you have taken to yourself as a wife, while him you have killed by the sword of the Ammonites."
Thank you. It's interesting how Nathan approaches the whole story, the whole situation. He comes to David. He opens the conversation with a parable, and he doesn't make any secret of God's distaste for this story. He minces no words, and he calls it evil, calls it despicable. And what is David's response? Vayomer David in text 3b, David says, "Chatasi Lashem, I have sinned against God." Vayomer Nathan David, and Nathan says to David, "Gam Hashem hever chatas v'leisamas." God has removed your sins; you shall not die. So this is very interesting. First of all, in the parable, when Nathan, which is just on a side note, it's kind of interesting. It gives us like an educational lesson, I guess, or even in interpersonal relationships. You want to tell someone off. You do it in a way of like you help them figure out what it is they did wrong. He gently tells them this interesting made-up story, and David's listening to the story, and he's getting all riled up, and what a unbelievable thing that the farmer did. And then when he's done, Nathan's like, "By the way, that's you." It helps him like when he realizes what he did. So unknowingly, David actually passed judgment on himself when he said, "As God lives, this man deserves to die." So he actually gave himself a death sentence when he said that. His words, "I have sinned against God," spared him his punishment. That's why Nathan says, "You shall not die," because David actually convicted himself. But his immediate response, and this is really the heart of the lesson, is the fact that he says, "I sinned. I acknowledge I have sinned." He's humble, he's succinct, he's conclusive, doesn't beat around the bush. "I was wrong. I confess. It was my mistake." And this contrasts this what we learned last week, very different, right? With Saul. What happened when Saul was confronted by a different prophet, that was Samuel the prophet, by his mistakes? Right away he starts, obfuscating, and he starts saying, I was under pressure. The people, they were rebelling or they were running away, and depending on the different stories, he kind of like deflects blame onto other people, onto the nation. Explaining how he was, he was under difficult circumstances, and that was our whole class that we explained about Saul's inability to stand up for, not for himself so much, but stand up for what he represents, which was God. And that was his mistake. David does nothing of the sort. Right away, he admits his error in the story. Right away, he owns up to it. Doesn't even try to rationalize or give any explanation context. He says, "Chatasi Lashem, I sinned." This is the powerful words that changes the whole story, and unlike Saul, he actually had a sound defense and justification for his actions. Now, you may or may not agree with this, as we're going to go through right now, the Talmudic thing, but But it's a very interesting what the rabbis say now. Because according to the Talmud, in fact, the Gemara says a shocking statement. David did not sin. So admittedly, you read this statement after everything we've just read in the actual text, in the actual Bible, and then you look at what the rabbis say. That's why we asked, is this the rabbi's fault? Because then you look at the rabbis in the Talmud, and they seemingly make a statement that sounds preposterous. You know, like on what evidence? How could they say that this is a kol ha'omer David chata einei elatay? Whoever says David sinned has made a mistake. You're wrong. First of all, admittedly, this is not necessarily agreed with by all the commentators. I mentioned the Abarbanel in the past. He always has seemingly a different take, a contrarian take to other commentators. And he actually says, he doesn't hold back. He doesn't mince words. He actually says, he quotes this passage of the Talmud, and he says, Hadvarim ha'ela him darchi drush. He says, these words of our sages, they're the ways of drush, they're the ways of homiletical explanation. It's like on a different, it's a different genre. He says, but the literal understanding of the story, he says, Einli laheshiv aleim v'akastav made al ma'aseh hara k'kulei b'firish. The story, the text, the actual Bible doesn't hide away from the actual sin. He says, he calls ma'aseh hara the evil action, and he says, if David didn't sin, how could he say? We all read the verse. He says clearly, I sinned to the Lord. Comes along rabbis and says, whoever says David sinned is wrong. What do you mean? David himself said he sinned. You don't need anyone else. But first of all, on a technical level, I want to explain, and again, you may or may not agree with it, but just to explain the Talmud's logic of when they say that David didn't sin, they're talking about on a very legal, technical level. It doesn't bring all the text over here because it'd be too much, but just to explain to you the two points the Talmud goes on to explain. First of all, we said there was two sins over here, right? There's adultery and murder. So, focusing on the adultery part, the Talmud tells us that David didn't commit adultery. Why? Because Batsheva wasn't married at the time. And Talmud explains that in the days of David, in ancient times, there was a rule that whenever a soldier went to battle, he would have to write a bill of divorce. He would have to write what's called a get. Why? In order to spare the wives the faith of becoming an aguna. Aguna means a woman who's tied down. She's stuck because she never got a bill of divorce, and we don't know where the husband is to be able to free her. And in the fog of war, soldiers can get kidnapped, soldiers can get, displaced. Who knows where they can just disappear, and we don't know where they are. So they made a rule to solve this problem, that it was a bill of divorce was made. In other words, husbands would divorce their wives before they went out to battle, and then if they came back, they survived, they would remarry. There's a difference of opinion in the commentators, Rashi and Tosfos. If you really want to get Talmudic, they talk about, is the bill of divorce tentative or is it a retroactive divorce? Meaning, is it something that it was a divorce that they signed a contract that if I survive, then our marriage is still intact? Or is it an actual divorce that we are divorced, and then when they come back from war, they actually have to get a new marriage. They have to have a chuppah, and a wedding, and a photographer, and to do the whole thing all over again. But either way, that's just a technical debate amongst the rabbis. What was the nature of this bill? Because it's a very interesting type of divorce. They're not getting divorced because they don't like each other, right? That's the typical reason why people get divorced. So another proof to this, the commentators explain, is that had she been an Ishes Ish, which means a married woman at the time, according to Jewish law, he wouldn't have been allowed to marry her even after her husband's death. It wouldn't have helped. Meaning he wouldn't, a woman or a husband, man who commits adultery, so both the person that you had an affair with and your previous marriage is destroyed. You don't reward the person for committing this sin, that now they get to live with the person that they ran away with. So it would make no sense that David, would continue to sin, meaning to continue to stay with this woman who, by according to Jewish law, he's not allowed to marry now if it was indeed adultery. So it's another technical proof that they bring. The fact that he remained married to her tells us that technically no adultery occurred. And it's also proof about, you mentioned about Solomon, right? So Solomon would be, technically speaking, if this was adultery and Solomon was born from this marriage, he would be called what in Jewish law calls a mamzer, which literally translated as a bastard, not the way we think of a bastard. And in other words, he would be considered illegitimate, and therefore he wouldn't have been allowed to be king. A mamzer can't be a king. So that's another, again, technical proof to show that this wasn't on a legal level adultery. And then to focus on the murder part. So how is he justified of that? Let's say on a legal level he was okay. He was exonerated from adultery. So on a legal level, the Talmud continues and says he also wasn't guilty of murder. Also, because Uriah was guilty of treason. And the rule is, Moirid b'malchus chayv bisa. One who rebels against the king, is disobedient to the king, is liable to the death penalty. Where do you see that he was disobedient? So first of all, David told him clearly to go home and go to his wife. He, admittedly, he seems like a very morally upstanding person. He seems to be very, what was his argument? He felt, how could I go home to my wife and just eat, drink, and be merry, whilst my brothers are out there and fighting in battle? So he doesn't listen to David. So admittedly, he was coming from a sort of a good place, but it doesn't really matter. These are the king's orders. The king tells you to go home, you go home. Second of all, when he explains to David why he didn't go home, he says, how could I go home so long as my master Yoav, who was the general, David's general of the army, is out there in battle? So that key word of it in the verse, when he refers to Yoav as his master. Yoav is your master, you're standing before the king, the master of masters, and you're referring to someone else as the master? That's an act of treason. Again, so these are very subtle points. Now, whether or not the Talmud's contention and the arguments, it doesn't really make anything better.
It's very technical, but it doesn't change the tone of what he did.
Right, and we're going to explore that. In other words, without a doubt, the Talmud is not implying that David is not guilty of wrongdoing. Again, that would clearly contradict the verses in the story. They can't do that. The rabbis can't do that. He wouldn't have been deserving of death if he acted like a saint. But the Talmud itself, the rabbis themselves, in other places, are replete with condemnations of David's behavior. In many places, they don't hold back. So it's not like they're on this mission to cover up King David. In many places, the rabbis criticize him and say things about him, we'll actually go through some of them, about different tragedies that happened to David in his life as a result of this story. The rabbis mention different punishments that he suffered from. So all they're doing over here is just explaining on a technical level, purely on a technical legal level, David was not guilty of adultery or murder. But obviously his behavior was still reprehensible for a man of his stature. That's why David's expression of remorse immediately is so remarkable. Because technically he had relations with an unmarried woman. Technically he arranged the death of a treasonous soldier. He had good excuses that he could have easily used, and he could have responded to the prophet's rebuke. Right? So he had more excuses than Saul. Instead, what does he do? He immediately acknowledges that such behavior, even on a technical legal level, might have been allowed, was morally inappropriate and utterly unacceptable, especially for someone like him, for someone in his stature, for the king of the Jewish people. So what's the point over here? We all tend to justify our behavior when we have, when able to. That's what, politicians are very good at that. They're notorious for justifying immoral behavior, unless there's like absolutely no way out. David, he never sinned. When the Gemara says he never sinned, it means on a legal, technical level, but he never used that as an excuse. He doesn't talk about it at all. And truth is, the cover-up is worse than the crime, because the cover-up demonstrates a lack of remorse. The fact that David didn't use that as an excuse it brings out even more the sincerity of his remorse. His refusal to cover it up, his courage to really own it immediately is something very admirable, and that's really the heart of David's greatness. So his life and his kingdom is spared, but he wasn't completely exonerated, and I'll explain why. So even though, again, he does tshuva, and the rabbis explain on a technical level, he wasn't guilty of these crimes. If you put him on a court of law. But I'll just give you some of the tragedies that happened to him in his life, how he was punished, which a lot of these things actually come from the Talmud. So the same Talmud that tells us he didn't sin also tells us that he was punished. So just to bring out the point that the rabbis are not trying to, they're not making apologetics. So as per Nathan's prophecy, it says the sword shall never depart from your household forever because you have taken the wife of Uriah. So it says that another 3 of David's children all died by the sword, Avshalom, Amnon, and Adoniyahu. As described in the verses that follow, the text that we read, so the child, when it says that she was pregnant, so she wasn't pregnant with Solomon. Now he comes later. The child that was conceived actually passed away from a tragedy. In general, you read his story and you reveal, the story of his son who tried to lead a coup to overtake his throne. Going to the stages for 6 months following the story, he was afflicted with saras. Saras is like a biblical form of skin disease. David was. And actually, for a full 13 years, he was afflicted with another type of suffering that actually caused him to be bedridden. Seems like it was some type of cold, according to the commentators. And probably the most painful thing of all was actually his rejection from God himself. For 13 years, for 6 months' time after the story, the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court, shunned him, and God didn't speak to him, as we'll read now in the Medrash. And this was a tremendous period of isolation. He was all alone, and it was only after 6 months that the Sanhedrin slowly re-embraced him, but God was slow to forgive. So if you read in text 5, I'll read the Medrash. It says, for 22 years, 22 years, divine inspiration departed from David, king of Israel. Each day during this period, David would cry a cup of tears and eat his bread with ashes. As it's written in Psalms, I ate ashes like bread. But David readily accepts all of these things, and he continues to pray and he continues to fast. And just to give you, so we mentioned before, we thought maybe it was just a moment in time. It says, Chatasi Hashem. It wasn't just a one-off. When he said before to Nathan, I have sinned, it wasn't like I sinned and he moved on. There's one of the famous verse in this psalm, famous expression, Chatasi Negdi Samit. My sin is always before me. So this is the answer. David's life and his kingdom, they were spared, but he wasn't completely exonerated, and he was severely punished, as we read, in a variety of ways. And he was for a time shunned by both God and the Supreme Court. And throughout this time, his heart is broken, and he's continuously preoccupied with teshuvah. And you see that in the verse that stands out, which literally means, my sin is always before me. So even though this specific psalm was offered shortly after the incident, but it was actually at the beginning of a decades-long teshuvah process. David already vowed never to forget his deed. He was promising that this sin will always be before my eyes. No matter what happens, no matter what the success is, no matter how much forgiveness he's granted, he'll never move on from this. We'll explain what that means and how to, moving on. But he had no plans to just repent quickly and move on. This was something that was going to stay with him forever. So obviously we want to understand, we'll explore the nature of this tshuva, because it sounds a little excessive, perhaps even unhealthy, to say that my sin is always before me. At what point can we say about David or about anyone, when can we say, forgive yourself or forgive the other person and move on? You're going to take this with you to your grave, you're never going to move on, you're always going to be feeling bad about this. What does it mean to keep repenting for your sin? It sounds a little extreme. So, first explain what it doesn't mean. What it doesn't mean is, depression and guilt. It doesn't mean that you always are feeling sorry for yourself. That's actually, self-obsession in disguise. The Alter Rebbe, the text 7, the Shnei Zalman of the Adi, explains in Tanya. He says, when King David says, Chatasi Nagdi Samit, you see, on the one hand, God forgives immediately. When we ask God for forgiveness, He forgives us immediately. So what does it mean? What are we supposed to learn from this idea that my sin is always before me? He says, it doesn't mean that a person has to constantly be feeling bad, melancholy, or feel humiliated. God forbid. Why? Because the same King David also says in the book of Psalms, right? And many of his Psalms are based on this story and based on his emotional reaction to this story and his desire for forgiveness and repentance. David says, Tashmi'enu sasa v'simcha. He says, let me hear joy and gladness. So David is demanding that we do feel a certain level of joy. So here's the precise language. The Alter Rebbe explains the word negdi, before me, actually implies something that is distant. Like he brings from a different verse. It says, mineged mirachik, to stand mineged, which means to stand from a distance, or the Levites shall camp mineged. They should camp at a distance around the tabernacle. That's how Rashi explains the word. So in other words, the verse, the sin should stand before me, is basically demanding balance. It's all about balance, like everything in life, right? The failure is always meant to be in our awareness. We should be conscientious of our mistakes, but we shouldn't have it. But it should be kind of like at a distance. It's not supposed to define who we are. We're not supposed to give up on ourselves and consider ourselves horrible people who can never, are irredeemable. Because that attitude will have a counter effect. We'll say, oh, I'm anyways a waste of time, so then I'll just do other things that are terrible. That's not the point. It's very important to understand that even though my behavior was faulty, and we'll soon see that action stems from a faulty character trait, that doesn't make me a bad person. We always have to know that God loves us, and therefore we have to love ourselves, and to know that every one of us is a soul that's pure, that's good, And from time to time, it's covered up with a little bit of schmutz. You know, we have to sometimes give it a little clean, because really it's always there, it's always beautiful. So that's the message of Chatasi Negi Summit, that my sin is always before me, meaning at a distance. We're ready to look at ourselves objectively, but without falling prey to for guilt. At the same time, we're always cognizant of our past indiscretion. Why is that important? Why can't we just, like many politicians, just say I'm sorry and move on? Why do we have to, have this always in the back of our head? So here's an interesting nuanced point, and again, this comes out in Chassidus, that there's a difference between acknowledging, that I had an issue versus I have an issue. Because the form without the latter is basically a waste of time. All likelihood it's going to happen again. If you just every time I'm sorry for what I did, it's because I'm sorry I have this issue. So you're not really addressing the underlying trait. And this gets into the idea of what is tshuva, because tshuva really has two levels. There's what's called a halachic tshuva. Halachic tshuva is like, the basic legal, technical tshuva. Just like David technically on a legal level was exonerated, so the technical legal tshuva, in Jewish law, when it comes to the section of the laws of Yom Kippur, talks about how to do tshuva. So it says there's 3 stages, there's 3 steps. Regret, I forget what I did, I promise not to do it again, and I confess what I did, both in terms between me and God and also in our interpersonal relationships, right?
Confession to another human being or to God?
Both.
Or to myself?
To the other, well, it depends on if you hurt someone else, for sure. To the other person, you have to say what you did wrong. It's not enough just regret it. The person doesn't know that you regret. You have to actually confess. Part of the remorse is developed because when you confess before someone, it creates like a certain humility and a certain feeling of shame, which is healthy. But how do we know that this person is not likely to do it again? Have we actually done? Has this level of this type of tshuva actually dealt with the core problem? So that is much harder. That's actually a high level of tshuva. The first level of tshuva, indeed, Yom Kippur comes around, call up that person that you said something wrong, and you say I'm sorry, and the person forgives you, and you move on. But it's one moment, one time, one phone call.
You repeat the cycle.
Possibly. You may or may not.
You come next Yom Kippur.
Right. It actually says in Jewish law about the Yom Kippur, it says that God took all the sins that you did between you and God can forgive you. But between you and another human being, God can't forgive you on behalf of someone else. You have to pick up the phone, and you have to call that person and ask for forgiveness. But advanced tshuva, a high level of tshuva, is not so simple. That's not just one phone call, one moment. That takes, that's no longer about what I did, but it's about who I am. The first level focuses on what I did wrong. The advanced level is there's something about my character that is wrong and requires work. To fix what we did takes just a moment. To fix who we are, or what we are, or what led to the character trait that caused that action, and that could take a lifetime. That's a continual tshuva. That's never ending, right? And every day brings us to a deeper, subtler form of correction, as we'll soon see. So in other words, you're fixing a much deeper. When you're fixing a character trait, you're fixing an emotion. That doesn't happen overnight. That requires a lot of work, a lot of patience, possibly a lot of therapy. It's not a simple thing. It's not just like, okay, the actual action is possibly redeemable. You damage someone's car, you fix the car, and you pay the company, whatever, to fix the car. You've done your job. But what about the character trait that led to your reckless driving? That made you got you in that place? That's a lot harder. That's more of a refined type of tshuva. So to get a better understanding of David's life from tshuva, and that's what we're saying over here. He didn't just say, I'm sorry for what I did. He was continuously sorry for the internal character that led to this. The Alter Rebbe explains, though a person may have done sincere teshuvah and thereby removed the spiritual blemish, teshuvah at the end of the day is a process of the heart, and it all depends on the spiritual status of the person in the current time and place. And for this reason, King David said, my sin is constantly before me. So there's the step 1, which is the regret, but then the step 2 is to actually identify the source of the mistake. And the higher our spiritual standing, the more work there is to do. To give you an example, imagine a teenager comes home one day and he's wearing ripped jeans and a horrible t-shirt with a terrible, inappropriate slogan, and he's covered in tattoos. And the parents want to hopefully influence him to start wearing appropriate clothing. And they'll be very happy that if the next day he comes home and he's wearing a nice pair of jeans and a nice t-shirt. But what happens when it's time for these teens to go to college? So that semi-respectable outfit won't do it anymore. Now he needs an upgraded wardrobe. And what happens when he graduates college and it's time to go, he enters the business world, and now he's going to need to upgrade again. He's going to need this nice suit. So, and when it comes to manager of the company, another upgrade. So it works similarly with tshuva. Tshuva is like, first we do tshuva for what we did. That's the baseline. We have to do that at least. That's something we can all manage. But then as we rise and we grow in our spiritual stature and we're capable of more, so the more we become capable, the more we can handle, the more we reach a high level of tshuva. An interesting line from Reb Nachman of Breslov, one of the great Hasidic masters, he says that sometimes we have to do tshuva for our previous tshuva. We have to do tshuva for our tshuva. In other words, we think of tshuva, we think always associated with sin. That's maybe the first level of tshuva, that's the basic level. But tshuva literally means, the actual word means returning. It comes from the word shuv, to return to God. To return to God is an endless life's goal, which is something every person has to do. Right? That also explains why people always ask when the Rebbe is saying Shemona Esrei, and he gets to the part in the Amidah prayer, he says Slach Lanu, and he does the sin. What's the Rebbe saying? What's he saying Slach Lanu for? Who are you saying for? You're a tzaddik. When you ever did a sin? So some people say one explanation is as a Rebbe, as a Nasi, as a leader, he's saying Slach Lanu not for him, but for the people that he represents. He's doing tshuva for us, which is true. Which is on one level, the tzaddik is like helping us. He's refining us. On another level, he's doing tshuva for the level that he was on 5 minutes ago. Because right now he's on a higher level. So he used to always grow, he used to always climb. It's never, God is infinite, and therefore our connection to God is infinite, and we can always do more, we can always grow. So that's why David, Chatasi Negdi Summit, he never stopped growing and being cognizant of his relationship with God. And it's a much deeper level of tshuva. The Gemara actually says, and again, this is an interesting line from the Talmud, it says that due to his spiritual stature, actually it wasn't possible for him to do what he did with Batsheva. To do such a sin would be impossible. So how did it happen? The Gemara says that God actually orchestrated the events. God caused him to do this in order that he should teach all future generations the power of tshuva. That David's tshuva became the paradigm, set the tone for all future generations. The Talmud is telling us that thanks to David, because of David, whether God orchestrated it or not, it enabled every single person in the future that it could always come back. David recovered, and that gave us the power that we could also recover. He taught the power of tshuva. He was the paradigm of tshuva. He's the example that time and time again, that's why in any prayer or the different psalms that talk about forgiveness, and they always evoke this story because this is the story that really is the paradigm of someone who fixed himself. He became the role model. And the Talmud says in text 9 that where a Baal Tshuva stands, even the greatest tzaddik cannot stand. A Baal Tshuva reaches one who's wholly righteous and he's never experienced a mess up or a mistake. He's incapable of achieving the humility and the sincerity of the Baal Tshuva, the one who feels remorseful. There's a certain refinement and closeness that the Baal Tshuva accomplishes that even the greatest righteous person doesn't get to experience. And David's Tshuva had its desired result. In text 10, we see that he was fully forgiven for his transgression. We're explaining central to Jewish thinking is that there is no mistake, no sin or failure that cannot be rectified by Tshuva. That's one of the great powers of Tshuva, is that it can accomplish forgiveness for everything. In fact, that's why the Kabbalists explain Tshuva, according to some opinions, is not even one of the 613 commandments. Because it's higher, transcends a mitzvah. It fixes anything that might be lacking in a person's life. So when someone we trust or we love or we respect is guilty of betrayal or abuse of power or something terrible, there's no obligation to forgive them immediately or to reinstate that person to their previous position, even if that person expresses remorse for what they did, and even if the remorse appears genuine and they're sincere, as you see with David, right? Even after he owned up to it right away, still God didn't forgive him right away. The Sanhedrin ignored him for 6 months. So regret wasn't enough to give him back the power that he had before. Prior to that, it appears that he was only reinstated after 22 years or after decades of engaging in such intense teshuvah. So the same thing applies for people who hurt us, right? When they commit their crime, they don't deserve our forgiveness. There's a reason why we have laws about forgiveness, about this discussion. If and when they demonstrate regret for what they did, then we're supposed to forgive them. Obviously, depending on the nature of their discretion. But even then, they still might not be ready yet to be reinstated or fully trusted, you know. So despite the regret, it could be that they still essentially remain the same person that they were before. Meaning they could be genuinely, sincerely apologetic for what they did, which is important. That's good. That's a good level. That's a good start. But it doesn't mean they're fully a changed person. It's only if the guilty party uses that failure, that mistake, as a springboard to become a totally different person. Really, and you see them. It could be they haven't fully changed yet, but you see that they're really working themselves, and they're relentless in their pursuit into trying to be a better person. So now they're in a position to be reinstated, because now the person before us is not the same person as before. But obviously, this is all true in theory. It's very nice to say this, but we're human beings. We ourselves have limited perceptions. We can't really know what's in another person's heart, and it's often impossible to know if someone's actually a changed person, even if they're expressed remorse. And this is especially true if we're dealing with public figures. We don't know them intimately. All we know about them is their carefully crafted persona that they put out there. So considering our limited perception of our ability to really know what's in a person's heart, we're within our rights not to really, to reject any leader, both communal or spiritual, who's betrayed our trust. And therefore, this idea it's not so relevant, or it's relevant to how we judge our leaders, but it's not so helpful because we don't really know what's in a leader, someone who's a public figure's heart. It's hard for us to trust them, right? They messed up. How many times?
It's so rare for a politician to even
own up to it.
Make the first step.
Right.
So where it is relevant, or where it can be more helpful, is in our personal lives, in personal relationships. People who are more, we interact with and that we're more intimately aware of. When we see a person who once hurt us is a truly changed person in that specific area, not only in other words, it's more than just they've expressed regret, but the words and then the behavior of this person is a different person. They're actually working on, and again, no one can truly fix their character traits completely. It's a lifetime's effort. We're human beings. We're not perfect. If you start going down that road, then you won't forgive anyone. Everyone's you'll find something wrong. But it's the fact that this person is actually working on themselves. They're generally trying to improve, and that's the most invaluable lesson that we can learn from this story. And more than just other people, perhaps most importantly, is how this pertains to ourselves. We have to know that regardless of what we might have done in the past, we're also never beyond redemption. That's what the story of David teaches us. Not only can we move beyond anything we may have done, but actually we have the power and the ability, the opportunity to emerge even stronger. And it's a very deep idea in Chassidus where it talks about how sometimes the sin itself can be the catalyst for even greater growth than that the person was before. And that actually the sin was also part of the plan. It's an interesting concept, because on the one hand we have free choice, but on the other hand God designed a system in a way that if a person does mess up, they're given an opportunity to use that mess up as a springboard for even greater growth. That now it says in the Talmud, that the sins become transformed into merits. We say this in our Rosh Hashanah prayers when we blow the shofar, that our iniquities, our mistakes, actually become merits. They become reasons that we point to God and say, hey, look, this was a point of growth. This was a point of growth. And this actually becomes a weapon, so to speak, of our defense, that we did teshuva, that we actually recovered, and that we're even better and stronger than before. The gates of repentance are always open.